let's return to COP26. More developments overnight. The Prime Minister speaking at this climate summit. Joining me live, my panel, Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg, from the Labor Party, Josh Burns. Thanks both for your time. I might actually start with you, Josh, because we had Will Stephan on the program. He said this is Australia dragging its feet. When we look at the global summit, the actions and words of China, Russia, India and Brazil absolutely dwarf what Australia is contributing here. If you're disappointed with the outcome, they're the countries we should be looking at, shouldn't we?
Good morning, Tom. There's a few things to say. First of all, Australia will find itself very, very difficult to lead if we are not prepared to lead ourselves. And our efforts thus far are not showing any leadership. Scott Morrison has taken Tony Abbott's climate policies to the Glasgow conference, a conference that's meant to be about increasing our ambition. Instead, Scott Morrison himself, in his glossy new brochure, said that his plan was all about existing policies. We should be lifting our ambition, increasing our targets, and leading, and then pushing other countries to do the same.
You've got UK doing that, the US doing that. Massive countries in terms of emissions compared to Australia, and huge countries on the world stage as well. You're just saying if Australia did a similar thing, that suddenly Brazil, China, India would have said, all right, okay, yep, we'll do it. We'll go earlier, we'll reduce emissions faster.
What I'm saying, Tom, is that we, in order to have credibility on the international stage, something that Scott Morrison is losing day by day, every day he turns up on the international stage, but if we were to have credibility on this policy area, this crucial policy global effort, then we need to lead ourselves. And at the moment, Scott Morrison's taking Tony Abbott's climate policy to a conference where we should be increasing our ambition. He's a diplomatic disaster, and he's paying, and frankly, Australians are paying the price for his sloppiness.
Andrew, I want to bring you in. I read your speech to a group of investors on climate change. You pointed out in 2015 is when we actually signed up to the Paris commitment of net zero 2050. And with the states and what they're doing, we get to 34% anyway by 2030. So essentially, Scott Morrison has taken to Glasgow absolutely nothing in terms of new commitments.
Well, Tom, as you know, in terms of the Paris Agreement, we did sign up to net zero in the second half of this century. What we now have is a target for net zero emissions by 2050 and an agenda to achieve that. So we have achieved that in the last few weeks, which is, I think, a significant improvement on our prior position.
Okay, what about 2030? Are you disappointed with all there is a projection, which, as your speech pointed out, even with the federal government doing nothing more at all, we would reach anyway with the input of the states?
So the first objective, I think, is to lock Australia into a net zero emissions target and an agenda to get there, which we now have at 2050. Then I think along the way, you want to show global capital markets in particular that you're on track to achieving that. And that's why the midpoint targets at 2030 and 2040 are important. And so I think...
So are you disappointed as a result then? What we've taken, there's no update on 2030.
So I'm happy...
6 years ago.
So I'm happy with where we've been able to get to in terms of 2050. I think we should keep on looking at the mid-range targets over the next little while, because we do need to show global capital markets that we are on track, because if you want to fund this transition, and a lot of this is going to happen in the bush, you need billions and billions of dollars. And Australia has never been able to fund itself, and we won't be able to fund the transition to net zero without global capital.
Let me ask this. Are you hoping, because Scott Morrison said there was an election pledge to Australians of 26 to 28% by 2030, should the government, your government, take an updated pledge to the voters this time around of an increased pledge?
Look, I think we need to keep on talking about 2030 and the interim targets over the next little while. I think that's a healthy thing to do.
Yeah, but should you take the target to the next election? This is the rubber hitting the road here.
I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't do that. If you thought you were going to achieve it anyway, then I don't know why you wouldn't adopt it. So I think that's a discussion we can keep on having. It's a healthy discussion. The projections show we're on the right track. the independent economists show that that's achievable. So we want to try and do it as much of this as we can because we want to send a signal to global capital markets that we're on track.
Josh, turning to the other big topic, at least for Scott Morrison, the submarine contract, Labor, from what I've seen, does agree with the decision. This was never going to be easy, was it? What specifically should the Prime Minister have done differently in your view on handling this?
Tom, the Prime Minister is a diplomatic disaster. If you cannot act in Australia's national interest while also acting on the international arena in a transparent, accountable, constructive and honest way, then you are unfit to be the Prime Minister of Australia. And Scott Morrison, of course, he can act in Australia's national interest, and the Labor Party has said consistently that we would do the same thing. We would act in Australia's national interest and make decisions on our defence capability in exactly the same sort of way. But what we wouldn't do is act in a duplicitous, shifty way like what Scott Morrison's done. Imagine what all of the world leaders must be thinking right now, that private SMS conversations with Scott Morrison are fair game for him to leak them to the media just because he's in a short-term political bind. The Prime Minister is a diplomatic disaster, and frankly, this conference has proved he is unfit to hold the job that he does.
Just struggling with your connection a little bit, but we did hear what you had to say. Andrew, this is pretty rare, isn't it? Either the PM or his office leaking a text from the French president. Is that diplomacy 101?
Well, I don't know about that, but what I can say is that I understand that the French...
Well, hang on, what do you mean you don't know about that? It happened.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. It's not anything I've been briefed on, so I can't comment on it. But what I can say is that I understand the French government is unhappy with the judgment that's been made to acquire the nuclear submarines. But the reality is we still have $6 billion in defence procurement contracts with the French government, and I imagine that they would want those contracts to be maintained.
We're nearly out of time. Let me just ask you this, Andrew. Is it good diplomacy to leak a text message between leaders?
Well, I don't know that has occurred, Tom, so I can't comment on that.
But is it good diplomacy as a principle?
Well, I think it's a hypothetical.
What are you talking about? It was in the telly, Andrew. You leaked it to the telly. I
think it's a hypothetical at this juncture, isn't it?
All right, we've got to leave it there. Our viewers can mull over.
Hypothetical. It happened.
Perhaps their thoughts on that. Josh, Andrew, we've got to leave it there.